Over the years, I've noticed that the best storytellers use active voice, not passive voice. But it's really difficult to notice this difference when you're listening to stories with your ears versus reading stories on the page. We may be able to tell that something is missing when we listen, but we might not realize that the passive voice is the weak ingredient in the story. So let's look at the difference so you can use active voice more consistently to transport your listeners with great storytelling. This is going to be a bit technical, but it's worth it. Active voice names the specific actor or subject in the sentence first. In other words, at the beginning of the sentence, that subject or actor comes before the verb or the action. For example, he swung the baseball bat. The word he is the subject or the actor in the sentence, and the word swung is the action or the verb that comes next. This sounds best for two reasons. One reason is that English is a subject-verb-object language. We call it an SVO language. Not all languages follow this order or this pattern. For example, as I understand it, other languages like German and Japanese are not SVO languages. But the default syntax for English is SVO. So as speakers, we will sound at our best when we structure our sentences in SVO order. A second reason active voice sounds best for stories is that listeners can better visualize in their minds who exactly is taking the action in the story because active voice provides specifics. Here are some examples. If I say, I made mistakes, it's obvious that I'm the person making the mistakes. If I say, England attacked the United Colonies, you know that England is the country that attacked. This may sound too obvious to you, but let's look at the passive voice and you'll see the difference. Sentences worded in a passive voice hide or camouflage the actor in the sentence. Passive voice doesn't name the subject, in other words. Instead of the active sentence, he swung the baseball bat, we get a passive version that says, the baseball bat was swung. Instead of an active version, I made mistakes, you get mistakes were made. Instead of England attacked the United Colonies, you'd get the United Colonies were attacked. In the passive versions of these sentences, we've hidden the subject and led with the object, which should be coming at the end of the sentence. Even worse, we've added the word was to the verb, which dilutes the action. The word was is a classic passive verb of being that shows no action whatsoever. But let me ask you this, where is the actor or the subject of the sentence? As we listen to passive sentences, instead of a specific picture that we see in our heads of a person taking action, we end up asking ourselves, who are we talking about again? Who swung the bat? Who made the mistake? Who attacked the colonies? That's why passive voice doesn't usually help with our storytelling skills. When it comes to stories, passive voice creates a visualization gap in our listeners' minds. The overall impact is that passive voice weakens our thoughts and makes them sound generalized. It makes our ideas sound vague. When you blur out the specific, listeners won't be able to see the picture clearly in their minds. As a result, your story won't carry them away. And by the way, if you are the actor in the story, you should use the word I. You should be talking in the first person. I know a lot of elementary and some high school teachers who say don't use the word I in your stories. That's usually bad advice when it comes to storytelling. If you are the actor in the story, then you can start your sentence with the word I. Now that's a topic for a whole nother video, but I wanted to mention it because it may be hurting your storytelling. Third, an active voice gives your stories momentum and a sense of progress on the journey. The passive voice just signals the existence of an activity. Active voice shows the activity and communicates forward momentum. Active voice drives good storytelling with specific places, specific people, and specific actions. Now, a quick caveat. It's perfectly acceptable to use passive voice some of the time. Listeners will follow along if you use passive voice here and there, so don't you dare misquote me in the comment section. I'm sure I'm using at least some passive sentences in this video. The key is to fight for an active voice whenever you can, especially when it comes to key moments in your stories. Now that you know the difference, let's take a very short story that uses a passive voice, and then we'll revise it and you'll see the difference. Here's the passive version. And I'm going to exaggerate a little bit to make the point clear. On Father's Day, sushi was picked up from Wegmans. Gathering downstairs, lunch was eaten by all three of us. Lots of conversation took place. As lunch was eaten, funny stories were told about the old days. The contentment of family was felt. Like I said, I'm exaggerating. I don't know anybody who uses that much passive voice. Still, the passive version sounds impersonal and distant. Even a few poorly placed passive sentences can take all the pop out of a good story. Let's look at the actively voiced story to compare how easy it is to picture. On Father's Day, my wife drove to Wegmans to grab sushi. She brought it home and called my son to come downstairs for lunch. All three of us ate together. I talked about how much I enjoyed being a father, and we all told funny stories about the old days. I feel most content in life when the three of us spend time together like this. This is a quick, ordinary story, nothing special. It's not perfect, but the second version sounds much better because the active voice in each sentence allows you to imagine the actual people in the story who take action. The cure for passive voice is simple. Use active voice, but that's not always easy. So here are 3 tips to do that. First, you have to recognize passive voice when you hear it. If you're ever practicing your own stories and they feel as if they lack that edge, you might be using passive voice. Be on the lookout for it. Second, revise your wording so a clearly identified subject or actor starts the sentence. Anytime I have a troublesome story in a presentation or in my writing, I almost always notice I need to put this subject first. As long as the subject comes first and the verb comes next, the rest of the sentence, called the object, will fall into place. Third, here's a pro tip. Look for action-oriented verbs to enhance your story. You'll usually find a good action word in most sentences, but they are sometimes lost among weaker words. For example, the sentence, "We were sailing by the lighthouse." It's not bad, but it's not quite as action-oriented as "We sailed by the lighthouse." I would argue that you can picture "we sailed" just a bit more clearly than "we were sailing," which is weakened by the word "were," which is not a word that creates an image. So the tip is to look for action verbs and don't dilute your action verbs by surrounding them with less specific verbs of being like are, was, were, or other helping verbs like have, has, had. When possible, let the action verb stand alone immediately after the subject and it'll sound a bit stronger. Stories are fantastic ways to illustrate a point in a conversation, in a meeting, or when you're doing public speaking. When you revise your stories with an active voice, your audience will be able to visualize and ultimately remember your stories for a long time. Be sure to check out my free resources on my website by following the link in the description below the video. Until next time, thanks, God bless, see you soon.